Hello, 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 and welcome back to the Uncarved Block. I really hope that my blue shirt doesn't look as awful to you guys as it does to me, but there we are. I wonder if I need more light in here. So I thought tonight I would look at a debate between Mark Reed and Jimbob, made by Jimbob. It concerns, well, I'll double check the title in a minute. I think it's Is It Rational to Believe in God or Believe in Christianity? So we will have to see what they have to say, what these gentlemen have to say. It was on the Raging Tomato channel, who is one of the most adorable mods on YouTube. I think she is pretty fair. I actually don't know where her biases might lean in this particular debate. But let's see how it goes. I'm not going to cover this entire debate, probably just the intros and maybe a little bit more. It goes on about 4 hours long. I don't know what these guys do with their life. I'm retired and I don't have time to do that. But okay, here we go.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We're doing Moderator Monday on a Sunday night because why not? I don't even know what day it is anymore anyways. This evening, I've got Made by Jimbob and Mark Reed. Mark Reed's coming in with his first appearance this evening. Let's make it a good one. Throw tomatoes in the chat to say a kind welcome. This evening's topic is God a rational belief? I'll be very interested to hear this. And of course, we're going to go ahead and kick off with Jimbob on the affirmative side. Can you give your opening statements, please?
All right. Is God a rational belief? I think it would be, is believing in God rational? But we'll go with that. Is God a rational belief? Jimbob will be on the affirmative side and the other guy will be on the negative side.
All right, thank you so much. Is God, the belief in God, a rational belief? Well, we should start by asking, what does rational mean? Let's just go with the basic definition. Rational is based on or in accordance with reason or logic. So how do we know a belief is in accordance with reason or logic? We can use different types of reasoning and investigation. We can use empiricism and the scientific method. We can present formal arguments.
However, I would say as a Christian that you necessitate revelation first. Science is secondary. Science is the lowest form of knowledge from a Christian worldview.
Yeah. Sorry. That was back before I knew how to download YouTube videos. So it was recorded on my phone.
Now, in this debate, it's important to note that not all truth claims are proven the same way. For example, if I wanted to know if there were crackers in the pantry this evening, I wouldn't use the same method as I would to determine the validity of Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems. With that said, the question of whether one thing is rational as a position and another thing, you have to examine what category it's in.
Okay. What category is God? Category unto himself?
In order to reason that the belief in God is a rational belief, I will be using a very simple argument for God. And by God, I mean a necessary, universal, and absolute mind. But before I present that argument, it's important that we lay out a whole plethora of other things we need to assume before we can even make arguments or inquire about whether or not a belief is rational. Now, we have to assume a plethora of things, as I said, right? So let's look at those things. We have to assume minds exist, minds which are capable of evaluating and appraising propositions. We have to assume that there's an external world and its regularity, which we couldn't do induction otherwise. We have to assume knowledge and truth exist. We have to assume information and meaning exists. We have to assume universals in order to speak of the world in any intelligible way. The reason I bring these items up is because we don't determine these things are rational. We use these things to determine whether some subsequent claims are rational. In other words, you have to first believe in these things on the screen before you can investigate. Now, keep in mind, all of the items listed are not found as matter. They are not determined using measurements or empiricism or science. They are assumed at the base level, right? There's no, otherwise, we're asking, how are those things justified? we're certainly not justifying those things by the subsequent methods.
No, I don't assume a mind exists or minds. I experience a mind. And based on biology, I can ascertain that other people have minds because all minds stem from an organic body. So if there were no organic bodies, there would be no minds. So minds don't exist in and of themselves. They have to have an organic body. Regularity of nature, again, is observed. We have documents going back. We know that it was raining when Benjamin Franklin was around because he documented it. We know that it was snowing. We know these things. We can also look at layers of the earth and determine regularity of floods and storms and trees. So regularity is observed. Knowledge and truth. He wishes to claim that knowledge and truth exist upon their own sake. Knowledge is just a term we give to often justify true belief. And of course, those three terms are terms we give to those aspects. But do they exist? Again, if minds didn't exist in organic bodies, then no such thing as knowledge or truth would exist. Knowledge and truth do not exist in and of themselves. Information, again, only if minds exist in organic bodies, as observed. He has no justification that minds exist outside of organic bodies. Information is simply material shared between one or more minds. But if we didn't exist, or if no creatures existed that have minds, then information would be irrelevant. A rock doesn't need information. Universals. Universals are common or shared characteristics or qualities that apply to multiple objects with entities, contrasting with particulars, which are specific instances of those qualities. For example, redness. But redness doesn't exist, Jimbob. We look around and we see apples and we see fire trucks and we see red hair and we say, oh, they share the universal of redness. But universals don't exist in and of their own. They're just abstractions. So I don't think Jimbob's off to a good start yet.
Being that logic itself is listed in the definition of rational as the arbiter for determining whether something is rational or not, it follows that we are holding logic to be universal. By universal, I mean it applies to all potential circumstances.
Logic is a man-made language. It's inspired by math. Normally you have an equation. You can fit all those things into mathematics. A equals A. That's math. Is logic universal? I don't know. Is it? It's a language created by men. Do aliens have the same logic? Do animals? Is it universal? It's just a language. And, it's just a way of formatting ideas. And so far, we found it to be one of the best ways.
I would also argue that logic, specifically the classical laws of logic, or the laws of thought, are absolute and universal. By absolute, I mean unchanging. They're not dependent on human opinion or convention. I would also argue that the laws of logic are conceptual and abstract. These three properties give me my first premise tonight.
I'm confused. How are the laws of logic universals? Because I think he flipped that term. He originally said universal as it applies to concepts or shared properties that can be instantiated in several different things, like redness. But then he switched to say the laws of logic are universal. So what shared characteristic, quality, or type, and what multiple things do they have in common? That would be my question to Jimbob. And the other thing would be, I think he's advocating realism. The universals exist independently of our minds and are real. But by saying it's a concept, can something both be a concept and real? Because a nominalist would say that concepts are not real. So maybe Jimbob needs to clarify that a bit more.
Premise 1. The laws of logic are universal, absolute, and conceptual. Now, what do we know about concepts? Concepts are mind-dependent. There is no concept we can refer to without assuming a mind. So my second premise is, premise 2, concepts are mind-dependent. But these aren't just any concepts. The laws of logic are universal and absolute and conceptual. Human minds discover universal concepts, but human minds don't create absolute concepts. We cannot produce universal concepts. We discern and discover these things. Do we create our own concepts that are not universal? Of course. That's not what's in question tonight. So the argument goes like this. I'll bring it up on the screen here so you guys can read it with me. All right. Premise 1, the laws of logic are universal, absolute, and conceptual. Premise 2, concepts are mind-dependent. Premise 3, universal concepts require a universal mind. Premise 4, universal concepts exist. Conclusion, a universal mind exists.
P1, the laws of logic are universal, absolute, and conceptual. What is the difference between universal and absolute? What distinguishes those two terms in meaning in this premise? And again, if he's saying that they are universal in the sense that redness is universal, is a universal, what are the commonalities in the laws of logic? P2, concepts are mind dependent. There is no demonstration that minds exist outside of organic bodies. P3, universal concepts require a universal mind. That one needs to be demonstrated. That would actually seem to be a conclusion from some other argument. So universal concepts require a universal mind. So redness requires a mind? Is redness a universal concept? What is a universal mind? Would that mean that that mind has commonalities with other minds? Do we have a commonality with God? P4, universal concepts exist. Do they? Demonstrate that. Conclusion, a universal mind exists. So yes, I would grant that this argument is valid, but I would not grant that it is sound. P3 and P4 and P1 would all have to be demonstrated. And that's the problem with a lot of these theological arguments that syllogisms, is that they think they can say things without them being demonstrated elsewhere. And P3 definitely is not demonstrated elsewhere. And P1 is not demonstrated elsewhere. In fact, there could be places maybe where those don't hold true. So to make the claim that they are universal and absolute, Jimbob has taken a heavy burden on himself.
Now, I could bring that back up if my opponent wants to examine it a little later. I don't expect him to copy the notes right away. But what I can predict tonight is that my opponent won't be able to reasonably reject any of the premises of my argument. I'll also add that by debating whether or not God is a rational belief, my opponent is already holding a position that we should hold to rational beliefs and abandon irrational beliefs. Now, the reason this is relevant is because we will find out tonight that my opponent does in fact hold some of his own beliefs, which under his own scrutiny would be reduced to irrational as well. So I'm wondering which beliefs he thinks are rational to hold and which he determines aren't rational. To close, I'm not only arguing that God is a rational belief, I will argue that God is necessary for rationality itself for the reasons I stated in the third paragraph of my opener. A reminder of what we're assuming tonight when we debate. These are the things that are held to, that are assumed, that under my view require justification, need some sort of binding, ultimate unifier. I would say God would be the binding ultimate unifier. Again, let's just review those items here. Mind. What is a mind? We need an evaluator for these things. Now, is a mind found in nature? It's not. Regularity. We just grant ourselves a regularity so we can do induction. Knowledge and truth. These are metaphysical. They're not material things. Information, again, not found as matter. It's not found under tree stumps. Universals. We're assuming that there are universals that we're using to talk about things. In fact, in the method of determining whether something's rational or not, you're actually appealing to this whole slew of things. Now, are these things that I just listed themselves rational beliefs? Like, we could swap God for the sake of argument with any of the things I listed. Are those things rational to believe in? Well, I don't know if my opponent would have a standard to tell me, because you need to assume those things before you then examine other positions. I'm going to ultimately argue that truth and knowledge is discovered and not created. That is to say, it's theonomous and not autonomous.
Well, I'm certainly not an expert on theonomy, but it comes from theos and law. It's a hypothetical Christian form of government which divine law governs societies. Theonomists hold that societies should observe divine law, particularly the Old Testament's judicial laws. The movement's chief architects are Gary North, Greg Monson, and R.J. Rushdoony. Theonomy presumes biblical Israel's Old Covenant judicial laws have not been abrogated, and therefore all civil governments must enforce them, including the specific penalties. Theonomy holds that all civil governments must refrain from coercion if Scripture has not prescribed their intervention, the regulative principle of the state. Theonomy is distinct from the theonomous ethics proposed by Paul Tillich. Theonomist describes something governed by or subject to God's authority. So I guess Jimbob is saying, unless he can clarify if he wishes, and certainly if he has scholarly articles that relate to his usage of theonomous as it applies to knowledge, saying that God governs knowledge. That would mean that knowledge isn't even a real thing, because if God governs it, couldn't he make it non-existent? Couldn't he manipulate it? And which he does in the Bible. God sends forth a delusion so that these men may not be saved. So Jimbo will have to clarify that. It's not a term I hear used often.
If you're going to critique a theonomous approach, you're actually going and rejecting a theonomous approach, that is to say that all knowledge, epistemology comes from God, you're going to have to argue it from the alternative position, which is autonomous. That is to say, knowledge is crafted by human beings as a collective, and we simply agree on what's true. From that standard, guess what? We would be simply agreeing with what's rational. Now, can that change? Can what's rational change based on our agreements? I'll let Mark, my opponent, let us know if he believes that that's the case. So without further ado, I'm excited to get into it. Thanks for having me.
So he's taken the word autonomous, which means having the freedom to govern itself or control its affairs. And it seems to apply, at least in the first sense, to countries or regions. In the second, it applies to Kantian moral philosophy, acting in accordance with one's moral duty rather than one's desires. I don't think Jimbob's opponent has to defend what Jimbob thinks is autonomous, and he doesn't have to defend the position that humans create knowledge. We developed a word to apply to the term, but I would say we have knowledge. Knowledge or justified true beliefs, and so then you delve into those three terms. Is something justified? Do you have a justification? Is it true? Humans should not, we can't really create truth. We can't. Truth applies to a proposition, and if that proposition is true, that means it is true in reality. We do not construct reality, and I think that's what Jimbob is trying to say here, that we construct reality, and no, we don't. And do you actually believe it? So if you actually believe something that's justified and true, then you have knowledge. So I don't think Jimbob's opponent really has to adhere to Jimbob's rules, and you should never adhere to your opponent's rules unless you agree with them.
Thank you, Jimbob. And Mark, the floor is yours.
I just do need to share my screen. I apologize.
Sure.
Just 1 second. Yep. And I will find the right one is probably a good idea. That one. Just let me know when it is on the screen.
You're there.
Hello, I'm Mark Reed. I want to say thanks to Raging Tomato for hosting the debate and my opponent, Jimbob, for opposing me. Also, thank you to the audience for tuning in, and thank you for giving time to me. So my position as a God belief is just like any other supernatural belief. There really is no sound evidentiary standard to warrant this belief. So what's rationality? It has a few different meanings, how it's applied. It can be applied to actions such as moral actions, where the one's acting rationally. But in this case, it's applied to belief because the debate is whether a belief in God is rational. Now, I do want to say up front that just because somebody is being irrational, it does not necessarily mean they're wrong. Someone may have an irrational fear of dogs, for instance, and it's correct that one dog on the street is in fact dangerous, even though their belief is based on an irrational justification. So rationality applies to the justification for the belief and how it is justified. This is part of something called epistemology, which in philosophy is the study of belief and knowledge. How do we know what we know and the reasons for believing what we believe? I also want to note, just because one has an irrational belief does not make them a rational person. That's more a shorthand for someone with a predilection for irrational thinking. A person can be irrational about one thing and think rationally in most or all other areas of life. So a few examples of irrational thought. Phobias are interesting, that these are usually born out of some sort of trauma or instilled as a child. A particular one of these we see in religious people is phasmophobia, or a fear of spirits or supernatural presence like demons or ghosts. The last one I want to talk briefly about, wishful thinking. In philosophy, this is appeal to consequence. When one says, well, if the thing I believe is not true, then it means a negative outcome, or if true, then a positive outcome. For instance, if heaven is not real, then people just die. Whether this is true or not has nothing to do with the consequence, and therefore is irrational thinking. So validity and soundness are need for rational thought. Soundness is related to how evident something is, or the arguments and evidence that you're providing can be demonstrated that the thing is true. I want to get across that something can be logical, but not true. For instance, it may be perfectly logical that my brother could be in the next room without him actually being there. Logical possibility does not speak to the actuality of a statement, and that is and only that it is not impossible. Much more is required to support a belief that it not being impossible. Hence why it needs some sort of evidence to support this belief.
Oh, Jimbob, I was worried you might have taken a bait that you were guaranteed to lose. Never debate a British person. But this guy's Australian, so you got a chance, mate. I don't disagree with what Mark says. A lot of theists will go on about this logical possibility. Unicorns are logically possible. Aliens flying out my butt is logically possible. Logical possibility is mostly irrelevant. All it can do is demonstrate you have invalid thinking or valid thinking, but yeah, you have to have evidence to back up your arguments.
There are two reasons why God is irrational, both related: lack of evidence and evidence to the contrary. I'll go over in a little bit why this is so in the next slides, in both lack of evidence and why the God my opponent posits is contrary not only to evidence but also to logic. There are many God claims with the same amount of evidence for them, but my opponent does not believe these claims are rational. Well, why not? If you can provide no more evidence for anyone else and their beliefs are irrational, then what makes yours rational? So if a belief is God is irrational, why do so many people believe it?
I certainly hope Mark gets to evidence to the contrary of God claims, traditional God claims.
This is where faith comes in. Now, I want you to pay a lot of attention to the definition of faith in the Bible. What do you notice about this? Substance of things hoped for. This is things hoped for do not have substance, nor any material structure at all. Evidence of things unseen. Things not seen and not observed are not evident. So this is a paradox or a contradiction in terms here. Essentially, it is saying faith is believing without evidence, without any good reason to justify the belief. Faith shores up where a lack of evidence fails, and for this reason alone, a God belief is irrational. Some theists I met would agree and reject that rationality is required for their belief and accept that faith is a decision to believe without justification because it is required by a God.
An interesting question for those who wish to defend their beliefs by claiming to use rationality and logic, such as Jimbob and William Lane Craig, is, does it matter? Is the belief of the little old lady down the road who truly believes in Christianity, is her belief any better than yours, any worse? It's a good question.
My opponent, I assume, disagrees. Now, I want to get into a logical problem, the Trinity. This has violated the law of non-contradiction, which basically states something cannot be both true and false at the same time. So something cannot be a cat and not a cat at once. The assertion that God is both one entity and three persons is a problem, as a person is an entity. So they are saying that God is both one and three. Three is not one. So they are saying that God is both one and not one at the same time. This makes the God posited logically impossible.
Hey, is this guy in any of my groups? Because I've actually proposed this argument before.
My last one is the problem of evil. This is where the theist claims that a God is all-knowing, all-benevolent, and all-powerful. However, we see evil in the world, and a God that is described would know how to stop it, have the power to stop it, and would want to stop it. However, this God does not, showing that God cannot have one of the aforementioned attributes. If God is evil, this would solve the problem, but this is not the claim. If the God has no power to stop it, again, it solves the problem, but this is not the claim. If a God does not know that suffering is happening, it solves the problem, but this is not the claim. The suffering can be claimed to be a good thing, but it solves the problem, but it creates more, which we can discuss. But I think I might be getting short on time, so I'll wrap it up there. Thank you.
Yep, no problem.
What they're going with, I think, is just open conversation. I'm not the biggest fan of open conversation, but I'm also not the biggest fan of, say, the Craig debates, where it's just one speaks, one speaks, one speaks, one speaks, one speaks, conclusion, conclusion. What I would prefer is to either have a response, and then open conversation, or what I would really prefer is either having a response and then a 10-minute guided challenging of your opponent, wherein you can ask questions, and if you wish to shut your opponent off, you can, and then the other side would flip. And you could eliminate the response and just go with the 10-minute questioning sessions. But I wouldn't want to do open conversation right after the openings. Open conversation right after the openings. Haha.
Sure, yeah. In your opener there, Mark, you said rational belief is something that's backed by evidence. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And do you hold that we ought not believe things that are not backed with evidence?
Well, it depends on what you mean. There may be other reasons for believing something apart from rationality, but if you want to be rational, then yes, you would have to believe that. For instance, you could believe something on necessity, for instance, like it's necessary in order to live my life that I do believe something, but it certainly wouldn't be a rational belief.
Okay.
However,
I would have said that anything backed by evidence is a superior belief.
having a non-rational belief in one area doesn't mean you're irrational everywhere.
Okay. I was just wondering because I was wondering if you, if there was an example of something that you believed in that was under your own standard irrational, or no, you think?
Now, this is one thing I don't like. In a debate, you should be addressing the arguments that your opponent has actually presented. Mark presented several arguments in his opening, and as of yet, Jimbob has not addressed them. And in a score debate, if you do not address your opponent's arguments directly, you lose. The problem with these types of debates is, one, there isn't always an agreed format, and two, there are no rules. So you can't say you have a winner and a loser. You can say maybe one guy did better, but that doesn't mean he necessarily won. But most of the time, when you have the Spurgs in the chat going, Jimbob won or Mark won, they aren't using any rules really. And I have often challenged some arrogant theists to score debates wherein we split the cost of a debate judge and the loser would reimburse the winner. And I've yet to have one accept.
I think people have a propensity to drop into irrationality. I'm certainly not claiming that I'm perfectly rational all the time. I think that people are predisposed to emotional reasoning, for instance. They will go, okay, well, I feel a certain way, therefore I'm going to make a certain decision. I'm sure you have done it yourself upon certain occasions and looked back and said, hey, that is irrational. But we're not really talking about my beliefs here. The problem with what you've said is that it's something called a tu quo quo fallacy. It means in Latin, and you also, even if I was irrational, it doesn't show that you are as well.
No, I understand.
Like the whole proposition that you're rational or irrational about your God belief is completely independent of what I
understand. Well, I understand that position, but if your standard for determining what's rational, if you don't have one that you use, then that's why I ask, like, for instance, do you believe in human rights exist?
Well, it's not about my beliefs. It's
no,
about
it is
whether
because
the God belief is rational. Because
we're
basically, if we're looking at where we are rational,
dude, let me just say one thing.
You asked a question. You asked a question, so I'm answering it. I'm saying that my beliefs have nothing to do with the debate. All you are trying to do...
Go ahead and let him land the plane, Jimbob,
all you're trying to do is poison the well by basically saying, hey, you've got this problem, and I think all my beliefs are rational, or at least I try to make them as rational as possible. And when I look back and see something that is rational, I try to correct it and say, hey, that was an irrational thought. That is what we strive to do. And just because I am irrational in one area doesn't mean I'm irrational in all areas. Do you think if a person is irrational about one thing, they are irrational about everything?
Nobody said that. Nobody said that. Okay, so the reason I ask about rights, I'll make it about me. I don't believe human rights exist. Is that an irrational position from your point of view?
Heads up, this is one of Jimbob's go-to arguments. I think he's used it in virtually every debate I've watched or listened.
What do you mean by they don't exist?
They don't exist. I think the belief in human rights is an irrational belief. Why? Because based on your standard, it's not supported. There's no evidence for rights existing, so it's a fantasy.
Yeah, so I think they're a social construct. And to say that a social construct doesn't exist, it's like saying that America doesn't exist, because that is a social construct. There is no objective thing to say that America borders should be here or there or anywhere.
I understand.
Or the properties that we
you didn't answer my question. I answered a simple question.
An actual thing.
I didn't
Just
ask.
like this, human rights
a
are a
question.
social construct.
I didn't ask what you think the right is.
Can we let's go?
This is why a 10-minute guided conversation on each side is warranted, because all they're doing, Jimbob doesn't like the way he's answering a question. So if it were Jimbob's question time, he could just shut him down. Just say, no, my time, stop talking. That's all he would need to do. But instead, you got the open conversation. So the moderator step in more often, which will be unnecessary with 10 minutes. Additionally, cat attack. I would say, well, if you're going to do things under my view, which Jimbob said he was, that means that Christianity is a social construct as well.
Go ahead and let Jimbob clarify.
I didn't ask
Mark
you.
can respond.
I didn't ask you what you think what a human right is. I ask you, is it irrational for me to say that human rights don't exist because there's no evidence? Is it irrational for me to say that?
So the problem is what you have with exist, because sort of social constructs exist. They don't exist and they're not real, but they don't exist in the world. But we have social constructs like the law. It's like saying, well, the law doesn't exist. Great, go out and break the law and see how far that gets you, mate.
Well,
that's the problem.
You're not answering my question.
Because it's a social No, I'm answering your question. Because it's a social construct, it doesn't exist. And yeah, I think that's
is it irrational for me to believe in social constructs, or is it more rational for me to accept social constructs?
Do you believe social contracts exist?
Contracts or constructs?
Social constructs exist.
Yes, I believe that social constructs exist, but human rights themselves, I would say, it actually doesn't exist materially. It's not evidence-based. That's what I'm saying is, like, from my view, it's rational to hold certain positions on metaphysical, ontologically based things as opposed to materially based. And I just want to know from your view, if you accept that there's a material existence of things that you could say exist, like an apple, then there's this other realm, if you will, in reality that you also accept. That's why I try to bring up rights, is because from my point of view, I want to know, if we're having a debate on whether God is a rational belief, it's fair to ask whether or not the belief in rights is a rational belief, because I'm using a parallel.
And what would that parallel be? I think under Jimbob's view, he's making a category error, because he has stated he does not believe rights exist, but he does believe God exists. So how is he balancing that with his own statements about category errors? And under Mark's view, I can't say it is, but it could be the case that God is a social construct, rights are a social construct, and if all of humanity just passed away, both those concepts would cease to exist. So I don't think Jimbob's doing him much favor for himself here.
Now, I still don't have an answer. Is it rational to believe in the social construct human rights? Is it rational?
Well, I can answer that now that I've got clarification.
Okay.
If you think that social constructs exist and human rights is a social construct, but you don't believe that human rights exist, even though you believe that social constructs exist, yeah, that's irrational. Yes.
Okay, so I don't believe actually that human rights exist as an item, but I believe the construct that's backed with force exists, that the agreement to say, well, we'll just say human rights exist and we'll back it with a gun. I see that exists. So
yeah,
if you agree, okay, great.
Exactly the same as America. It doesn't actually exist. They back it with a gun. What's the difference?
If you agree that human rights don't actually exist, but the social construct does exist, would you agree that the belief in God is a social construct?
The belief in God exists.
Yeah, that's a social construct. Just like the
I'm
belief in the rights.
I'm not arguing that the belief in God does not exist. I'm not arguing about that.
Hold on a second. You're arguing if it's the fact that you agree that that rights are a social construct, and in that way it's rational to believe in them as an existence.
Yes.
And you agree that the belief in God is a social construct. It would be just as rational to believe in God as a social construct as your belief in rights. That's the end of the debate.
Yes. No, it's not.
So you conceded the debate.
No, because we're not.
That's the end of the debate, dude.
God as a social construct is rational to believe in. We're talking about God as an actual thing is rational to believe in. You're committing something called.
No. Actually, no. The debate isn't. No.
You don't believe in the actual God. You only believe in a social construct.
What's the topic of the debate?
This evening's topic is God a rational belief?
Regardless of whether God exists or not, the belief in God is rational. Is that the topic, or is the topic, does God actually exist? Okay, cool.
So if this is basically word games that you're basically...
No, it's not word games. Oh my gosh, Cope.
Only belief in a social construct, which it's not. It's belief in the actual God and deity.
No, we didn't.
So you're basically just trying to go around the subject by playing word games.
I went right to the...
Point to others. Make sure both sides understand not only what the debate topic is, but what the debate topic means.
Right.
Do you think that the subject of the debate is belief in a social construct?
Well, if you're saying God is a belief that...
Answer the question.
I'm clarifying. I'm answering. Dude, let me answer. If you hold that God is a social construct, just the way rights are, and you accept that the belief in rights are rational, then the belief in God is rational.
No, that doesn't follow, Jimbob. Even if they are both social constructs, believing in one and not believing in another is not irrational. For example, we can believe that women have the right to vote. That, I would think, is a rational belief. Believing in God, even if a social construct, is not a rational belief. Not all social constructs are rational beliefs. Hopefully, Mark will say this.
Do you believe that God is a social construct?
No, I don't personally believe that.
Do Christians believe that God is a social construct?
Where in my opening did I say anything about Christianity? I pointed to the argument.
Do you think theists believe in God?
Dude, you're not engaging with my arguments. You're right. You prepared for the wrong debate, by the way.
Semantics.
No, it's not semantics. Look.
I think, and I could be wrong, I've been at this for a while, so I've had a lot of ideas coming into my head. But he claims Jimbob's not dealing with his arguments. However, those arguments should be the arguments Jimbob presented at the beginning, not any arguments he wants to bring in later. Again, debate format, debate rules. If these are not agreed upon, there's no winner or loser.
I'll give you my argument. Let's see if you can hang with my argument. We're nothing about Christianity, nothing about the triune Godhead, by the way, in my opener.
Oh, the wishy-washy God argument. The argument that doesn't argue for any God, any particular God. I don't allow this. If a Christian wants to debate me, does God exist? It will be the Christian God and the denomination that they believe in. If a Muslim wants to debate me, God exists, it will be the God that the Muslim believes in. Hindus, whatever, the God you believe in, not this wishy-washy God. No. Mark should not have allowed that.
Premise one, the laws of logic are universal, absolute, and conceptual. Do you agree with premise one?
I don't know that for absolute sure. They seem to be. I wouldn't say that is
so absolute. For the sake of argument?
How do you know they're absolute, universal, and how do you know that?
How do you know that the laws of logic are absolute and universal?
Yeah.
Because I would know that by any attempt to argue otherwise would assume those laws. You would have to use them. Yes,
no, they can be ubiquitous and still apply.
That is assuming they exist, which holds to the laws of thought.
Sure.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying, is that to argue against premise one would be a contradiction. That's why I know premise one is true.
It wouldn't. No,
yes,
it
would.
Because I can assume those
argue
are true
it.
Actually, We'll argue against them without using the laws of logic.
Yeah, argue against them without assuming they're true. Go ahead.
No, I can assume they're true without claiming to have knowledge they're absolute. This is what's called black and white thinking.
So you're assuming that, okay.
In one case, you either have absolute knowledge or you have no knowledge at all. And this is what's
the premise
called black and white.
Okay, dude.
It basically means that you're either assigning 100% knowledge or 0% knowledge with any kind of if you just let me speak, Jimbob, because I'm trying to speak and I let you speak, because you don't seem to have any filter on yourself. Basically, you can assume confidence in what you're seeing and what you're experiencing around you. And we make presuppositions on this that carry out to be true every time we use them. After trillions upon quadrillions of this being true, we can pretty confidently say they are true. They are also properly basic beliefs that nobody has to impart into you, like a God, for instance, that you just know as a baby things are things, and you basically learn that as you go along.
So with that said, so it's not, from your view, it's not actually true that based on that rationality itself, to call something rational is basing it on or in accordance with reason or logic. That's just an assumed thing you can't actually know from your view.
What do you mean from my view? You
look,
you haven't explained how you know it's absolute yet. So please explain
how
let
me talk a second.
Is
unbelievable, dude.
I did
You're like a wind-up. You're like a wind-up toy. Okay, I said,
and then
Mark,
you try to
go ahead, Jimbob.
Wow,
Jimbob, finish your thought, and then Mark, you respond.
Mark, my premise one, for the sake of argument, was the laws of logic are universal, absolute, and conceptual. You said I can't know that. I said, okay, let's swap the premise one with the definition of rational. Is it, if premise one said rationality is based on or in accordance with reason or logic, are you going to say the same answer? I can't know that. Are you going to say that?
I believe that. Sure.
Okay.
I believe that. Yeah.
Great.
So knowledge is justified true belief. So I can know something, I can also justify it. But what I don't hear is
I'm trying to make an argument, dude.
Let him finish,
how do you show that the laws of logic are in fact absolute and universal? Well, you don't need my answers for that. Just do it.
Okay.
Exactly. Jimbob is trying to make you take on his burden. Don't answer his questions. Just go defend it. Defend it. Defend it. Don't defend it by asking me questions. Just defend it. Go ahead. Defend it.
Okay. The laws of logic, you're saying the laws of logic might not be universal and absolute, right?
I believe they are. Yeah.
Okay. Let's just believe they are for a second. Okay. Because we're talking about belief. So let's just take all these premises as beliefs. Okay. Is it rational to believe that the laws of logic are universal, absolute, and conceptual?
Well, what I'll go back to is my question,
fucking believable.
Which is basically, can you show that they are absolute and universal, which you haven't done?
Mark,
which isn't showing.
Mark,
what I'm saying.
I'm trying to run an argument. You won't even do the argument with me.
No, I won't. You're not answering my questions.
Why don't you
answer the question?
The title of the debate is it rational? Is it rational to believe in God? So I'm going to stop for a second.
As I said, which you ignored, there are properly basic beliefs.
I don't care. I'm asking about a premise.
Well, what are you talking about?
I'm asking you to engage with my premise.
You don't like the answer, so you're going to
want you to engage with my premise one, Mark.
Gentlemen.
Is it rational to believe premise one? Okay, the laws of logic are universal, absolute, and conceptual. I didn't ask whether or not you absolutely know that. I said, is it right? Is it rational to believe premise one, the laws of logic are universal, absolute, and conceptual?
Sure.
Great. Premise two, is it rational to believe that concepts are mind dependent or mind associative?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. They are.
Okay. Is it reasonable to say that humans can't generate universal concepts, things that are absolutely true? Given that you rejected the absoluteness of premise one, you should probably agree with premise three that say universal concepts require or universal concepts can't be created by humans.
As far as I know, they can't generate universals.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay, great. So if premise two is concepts are mind dependent, is it, and we know that humans are finite and we're not absolute and we don't have full knowledge, is it fair to say if they're mind dependent, if the laws of logic are mind dependent and conceptual, and humans can't generate these absolute concepts. These you're believing that this, okay? We're not proving it. We're believing that these premises are true.
No,
Is
no,
it fair? Hold on.
making-
Is it fair to say that universal concepts would be tied to a universal mind?
No, this is a reification fallacy. What you're doing is saying, hey, the laws of logic are basically, well, the laws of logic are a description of the properties of our reality.
Are
They're
they?
a description of how it works. Yeah, it's a descriptive thing. It's like saying, okay, we've got, well, do you think that the laws of logic, like A equals A, is actually out there floating somewhere?
No, I believe that the laws of thought, being conceptual and abstract, don't exist as matter. So we agree there. So,
this is the reification fallacy.
I just said they don't agree. They don't exist as matter, bro.
So
that's the opposite of a reification.
I think Jimbob is correct on this. The reification fallacy, also known as the fallacy of misplaced concreteness or apostatization, occurs when an abstract concept or idea is treated as if it were a tangible, concrete entity. It's a fallacy of ambiguity when an abstraction is treated as if it were a concrete real event or a physical entity. From the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, we should be open to the possibility that it is not an exhaustive dichotomy. So some objects are neither abstract nor concrete, for holes and shadows, if they exist, do not clearly belong in either category. Note or ghosts, Cartesian minds, fictional characters, immanent universals, or tropes. Some philosophers see the main distinction as not between abstract and concrete objects, but as between abstract objects and ordinary objects, where the distinction is a modal one. Ordinary objects are possibly concrete, while abstract objects, like the number 1, couldn't be concrete. So, and there's a very long article about that. But I agree with Jimbob. He is not making the reification fallacy.
Of logic, the place is basically the universe. Like we're creating these laws as an explanation.
Mark, what's the misplaced concreteness fallacy, please, for the audience?
What's the misplaced concreteness?
Yeah, reification. What's the reification fallacy?
Yeah, it's assigning to a abstraction properties of the thing that it is describing.
Oh. No, that's mistaking the map for the territory. Correct, Mark. The map-territory relation is the relationship between an object and a representation of that object, as in the relation between a geographical territory and a map of it. Mistaking the map for the territory is a logical fallacy that occurs when someone confuses the semantics of a term with what it represents. To me, that sounds like what Mark is saying is a reification fallacy. So that is incorrect.
Okay, so where in the rock preceding all human minds is the law of identity located?
Where in the rock of mind?
No, where in the rock?
You
got to listen to me. Where in a rock before all human minds existed? You believe there's a time before all human minds, right?
Sure. Oh, yeah,
okay.
Sure.
Great. So that's a past, right? So you believe in a past that that included material things, right? Yeah. Rocks, planets, these things, and they operated a certain way. Okay. I'm saying that in that
way it operated, we describe with the laws of logic.
You weren't there to watch this, okay? I'm saying in the past, dude, in the past, there's this reality of that's a hard reality, right? It's concrete. I'm asking you, does that reality abide by the law of identity?
It does, yeah, but the law of identity is a description that we've given to
How is it? No, hold on.
Properties. It just has the properties of being something.
Let him finish, Jimbob. Let him finish.
Something is not something else. That's the property. We have codified that into the laws of logic.
I understand that, but I understand what you're saying. But
exclude. Yeah, I don't know why he just keeps interrupting. It's absolutely
Jimbob.
2 reasons. 1, it's a tactic. 2, sometimes he just can't be quiet. That's my opinion, anyway.
Is that a urine jar?
And Jim Bob, you know my rule. Even if you want to respond with "That's fucking stupid,"
I
at
apologize.
least let him
I'll let him
finish.
finish.
Thank you.
But what I'm not hearing here is any kind of justification for your God. It's just a big, well, see, the point is that these laws of logic, these things that we say, hey, it's inherent to the universe, you're saying, hey, a God is responsible for creating them somehow. I say, hey, they're just describing an inherent property of the universe. If you want to go, oh, well, the laws of logic by I mean the properties of the universe that have an identity, etc. Okay, all right, I get what you're saying, okay? But I don't think they're conceptual. I think they are just a fundamental property of the universe.
I know that dude, you can't just you can't filibuster me, bro. Stop filibustering.
I am not hearing.
I'm on the positive. You're supposed to be critiquing my statements.
No, what does that matter? No, that's not how debate works.
I'm on the positive. I'm the affirmative. I'm the affirmative. You're not critiquing me. You're not critiquing me.
So what I want to know is you're claiming these aren't inherent to the universe and they're coming from a God. I get that. They're coming from the mind of a God. How can you show that is in fact coming from the mind of a God?
First
okay.
Bet he won't. Watch.
Okay, cool. The irony here is that you just reified the laws of logic as some inherent properties of nature, okay? I asked you a simple question. Before all human minds could describe the world, there was a world that existed with objects that held their identity. I asked you, do those objects abide by the laws of logic? And you said they do. I said, where in that universe, given that you said they're properties of nature, where is the law of identity a property of an object?
Well, then I misspoke because I meant that they abide by the properties of the universe and the laws of. Do you think the laws of logic?
You're asking me a question
as a conceptual thing before humans came along.
I think the laws of logic apply to nature itself. The nature itself follows those rules. It doesn't. A rock stays a rock. Hold on, doesn't turn into something else. So it's abiding by these laws, right? It's abiding by these laws. It doesn't violate the laws of identity. Right?
I see the problem here. You're saying the laws are prescriptive, right?
No.
They are No. I'm saying they're descriptive. But what I asked you,
if they're descriptive,
laws of logic exist before there were human minds to come up with them.
Yes, because if you're saying they're descriptive, do you know what has to exist for you to describe something? A referent?
I could be wrong. But aren't fictional things reference? For example, if I say Gandalf, isn't the Gandalf in the stories of the Lord of the Rings a referent? So if I'm correct, a referent doesn't actually have to exist. So, yes, I almost forgot. I wasn't going to continue. I think that's about enough. This video is going on almost an hour. And in reality, I've been working on it for probably over 2 hours. I did take a little break to go make a marinade to stick in the fridge, but that didn't take long. So yeah, I don't know if I'll continue with this. If a lot of people say they want me to, I might, but it seems like a lot of talking back and forth. Jimbob's really wanting to steer it this way, and Mark is allowing him to. And you really shouldn't allow your opponent to steer too much. Jimbob needs to defend his premises, and you don't defend your premises by just asking your opponent what he thinks of them. If your opponent says, defend that premises because I don't accept it, then you should defend it. However, there are some premises that don't need to be defended. All men are mortal. That's not a premise that needs to be defended. Socrates is a man. That's not a premise that needs to be defended. If Jimbob is going to make premises that aren't universally accepted, then he needs to defend them. And that's what he's done. He's created an entire syllogism where he can't defend them, apparently. And he is only attempting to defend them by making his opponent challenge them. Well, thank you for watching. I know I got to work on saying and I got to work on not doing that too much. But yeah, I'll continue to make these. Jimbob is a debate machine. He looks kind of tired sometimes. I hope he's getting his rest. But this was mildly entertaining. Again, I prefer a bit more structure, but it is what it is. Take care.